Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Matthew Heines, author of The Rainier Paradigm. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be on.
Are you ready to get started?
I believe I am.
All right. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
Well, the first thing I would do is make sure, because you're going to end up spending a lot of time on this project, and depending on where your area of expertise is and what your project is, you want to make sure that there is going to actually be interest in it. So go out and just canvass people and ask people what they think about your idea, because and don't ask mom or dad or the wife or the kids, but actually just go out in the community and say, yeah, what would you think about a book like this? Or don't you think somebody should make a movie with this plot, or somebody should look into that? But try to find interest in your book and in your topic before you get started. And also, people, when you hear feedback, you'll also find a way to maybe narrow things down, and people can set you on a track of maybe how you want to write the book or how you want to approach it.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
The hardest part about getting published is getting published. If you're talking about the traditional sense, I would say it's almost impossible to get published. If you look in bookstores now, they're all about, like I had a chat with somebody that was in the book business, and the big thing now is mysteries and like whodunits and stuff like that. So you want to find something that is actually going to be commercially marketable, because that's really what agents are looking for. They want to find something that is going to meet a particular niche. So that is the beginning of the hardest thing to get published. But if you're talking about the traditional sense, you have to have your query letter and all of the steps and all the hoops you have to jump through. And if you do one thing wrong, then there goes your big book deal.
And for your books, were they traditionally published or were they self-published?
My books were self-published. I went the traditional route with My Year in Oman, my first book. And I just found out that a lot of people didn't know where the country of Oman, which is next to like Dubai and Saudi Arabia, actually is. So I had a lot of agents that would send my manuscript back with Oman corrected to spell the capital of Jordan. So that was one obstacle that I ran into. And then I just think that, based on that I think a lot of agents, based on their not knowing anything about the Middle East, didn't see a real interest in it until finally I did find somebody who loved the book, because it's actually very funny and it's very tongue-in-cheek, and it's about almost like the ugly American going over to the Middle East during the War on Terror. And anyway, I found somebody that loved it, and unfortunately, after a year, she told me to keep being patient, but after a year, I contacted her, and she was no longer with the company. So I lost a year on that. And at the same time, CreateSpace and all of these publishers that will help you publish your book were coming out. So I just said, I'm not going to do that again. And also, if you look at self-publishing, you get to keep your profits. So for me, after that, I felt really bad about losing a year. But for me, self-publishing was a win-win situation. But it's also a lot of hard work, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Well, and that's going to transition nicely into our next question, and that is about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
Well, what the best marketing strategy that I used, and I will just use not myself, but I'll use John Grisham, author of The Firm. He had actually written the Pelican Brief, and on one of his other books, I don't know if you know the story, but they didn't want anything to do with him. And when he wrote The Firm, they finally published his book. So I had a series of books about my experiences living and teaching in the Middle East. And again, Middle East, war on terror, and also not the traditional, bang 'em up, shoot 'em up. It was more of a, yeah, these people are really human beings and they're really nice and they treat me very well, which is a message that our media probably didn't want to purvey. So I, uh, I, I, um, I kind of have lost my train of thought here, but so the Paul, can you just ask the question again? I'm very sorry.
No, you're fine. We were talking about marketing strategies, and what I wanted you to
Yeah,
do is to share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches. And if I
yep,
remember correctly, you have 5 books. So
yep.
just share with us what's worked well for you.
Well, what I did, I'm sorry to get off on that tangent, but I wrote another book. That was where this was all going. I had written books about the Middle East, but I just wrote something of another genre. I love history, and so I wrote a book called Deceptions of the Ages, and that turned out to be my best-selling book, and it still is. And so that's the one thing that I did. But Paul, also, I have 3 YouTube channels. I'm actually starting my own podcast. So, and have run for office. And so I just about anything that you can imagine to promote my books, I have done.
Well, and I remember we talked offline previously, and you were talking about utilizing social media, and you also mentioned a great strategy about not only going out and meeting people, but also advertising your book on your car. So I wanted you to walk us through that process.
Okay, sure. One of the things is that I have a 1991 Toyota pickup. I've got a canopy on the back with a big window. And so on that window, I have books in hindsight. I have my logo and I have a message, love one another. And so my website and everything is all right there for everybody in the Seattle traffic jams to see.
Well, and that you're actually the first person we've had on the show that actually specifically mentioned using advertising on your car. And that seems to be a great way to promote a business and also to promote a book.
Well, it is. I mean, think about, I don't know where you live, but I live in one of the worst traffic areas in the world. And when I'm out, I want to be working. I want to be advertising. So it's a way to make a bad situation a little bit good. And I do get book sales, and I'll stop in parking lots, and people will come up and say, "Well, what kind of books do you write?" So it's pretty nice, and you get a lot of free exposure because you're sitting in traffic, and a lot of people are going by.
Yeah, I understand that. I live in Arlington, Texas, which is the heart of the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex. And anytime you go to Dallas, you got traffic. Anytime you go through
Right.
Fort Worth, you have traffic. Unfortunately, Arlington, we're not too bad. We're a suburb. But if you actually count us as a city, we're larger than Pittsburgh. But so we do get a little bit of traffic from time to time, but not nearly as much as some of those larger areas. And I had the pleasure to go to Seattle a few years ago for a big conference and actually got to go to a Sounders game and a Mariners game. And you're right, there's definitely can be a lot of traffic out there to say the least.
No, yeah, it's becoming a nightmare, and it just gets worse.
Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So, what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Well, my favorite book, and this might sound odd to a lot of people, but I love history. I've always loved history. My first books when I was a little kid were about history. So I love the dialogues by Plato. I love the Republic. And the reason I do is because I really like philosophy, but I like how the way that the Greeks and how it is written, how they really boil down what we call knowledge. They boil down our attitudes, they boil down our societies, and they just look at everything and they question everything. And I when I read that, I just thought that is a whole new way of looking at the world. And then I realized where our academia came from, and I realized where philosophy came from, and science and everything. It all started with those guys sitting around drinking watered down wine and talking about things in their symposiums. So that would be one of my favorite books. But there's so many wonderful books out there that I've read that have had such a influence on my life, and I do like I said, I love history. So most of my books are biographies that I read, or about an event that happened, or whatnot. And like my Deceptions of the Ages book is basically a compilation of everything I've ever read, put together into one book.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Well, my favorite quote is knowledge without wisdom is like a machine gun without a safety. And what does that? Oh, the end of it is a lot of people are eventually going to get hurt.
Well, Matthew, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Oh, just Google Matthew Heines. I've got so many pages. Just go to Hindsight, HeinessIGHT, Heines, my last name, site, one word, hindsight.com, or you can look for me on Books in Hindsight. I have my own podcast, and you can find me on YouTube at Deceptions of the Ages News, Matthew Heines, or Matthew Heines for Senate, because I ran for the Senate in Washington State in the last primary.
Matthew, thanks again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
All right, Paul. Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's great talking to you.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.